All right, next I want to talk about colonialism, or the colonial period in Middle America. And it really starts with the Spanish conquest in the 1500s. And this is after, after Columbus arrives. Columbus arrives in the Caribbean region, and then subsequently you have more and more Spanish exploration and conquest into much of Middle America. So the Spanish control most of Mexico, most of Central America, but in the Caribbean it's a little bit more mixed. You had a large Spanish presence in places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic, but you also had other countries there as well. So, for example, Haiti here was a notable French colony, and Jamaica here was a notable British colony. And then along the coast and throughout the Lesser Antilles, there's more of a mix. You had some British presence in parts of some port areas of Central America, and kind of a mix of different countries in the Lesser Antilles. You show this figure here, kind of showing the situation in 1794, which is just after the independence of the U.S. So the United States, which was a former British colony, is now independent. You had the British up in Canada, but then from the interior United States, massive amount of area, through Mexico, through most of, but not all, of South America, this is the Spanish Empire. Now, you had a large Portuguese presence in Brazil, but we'll talk more about that later. But I do want to, for right now, highlight, you can see this is the British here, got the French in Haiti, and then various other colors in the Lesser Antilles. And one thing to highlight about the Spanish conquest and colonial period is the massive demographic change in the indigenous populations that you have. More than 90%, it's really hard to capture this, to know exactly how much, but in many cases, over 90% of populations in some areas were died as a result of conquest. Maybe not because they were killed directly, but because they lacked immunity to diseases that were brought by the Spanish, and these diseases just ravaged through populations. Some which never actually even came into contact with the Spanish, but diseases would be transmitted into the interior and just wreak havoc on indigenous populations. Another thing about the colonial period is there's also a change to the physical environment as well. Especially when countries began to establish plantations and clear forests and plant sugarcane, that you have massive environmental changes as well. Now, the colonial period starts to really fizzle out around in the 1800s, when many of these countries start to become independent. There is an independence movement, kind of one country at a time. And the United States helped to kind of promote the maintaining of the independence of these countries through what was called the Monroe Doctrine. What that did is the U.S., through this doctrine, really discouraged Europeans from recolonizing many of these newly independent Middle American countries. But at the same time, the U.S. was really kind of highly involved, almost as a colonial power, but we didn't like to call ourselves that because we were a former colony ourselves. It's a picture of a concept called the Columbian Exchange, that with the mixing of the New World and the Old World, so to speak, you had the movement of different kinds of food, domesticated crops back and forth. So plantation crops like bananas and sugarcane were brought to the Americas and established on large plantations. You also had things like livestock, cattle, for example, and various other, things like horses. And you also had an exchange in the other direction with foods like tomatoes, corn, and particularly the potato. That the potato is indigenous to South America, and some can make the case that bringing the potato to Europe and having it widely available as a staple crop really changed the demographics of Europe back prior to the Industrial Revolution, and may have actually set the stage for the Industrial Revolution because of the population stability, at least at one, for a certain period of time, because of the bringing in of a new type of crop rather than everybody being reliant on wheat. Right, these are some figures that from Wikipedia that kind of show some of the colonial situation over time. So I just want to maybe highlight a few things. 1700, strong Spanish presence. You had some British presence along the coast and in Jamaica and various other parts of the Lesser Antilles. The French here in Haiti, and then other parts of the Lesser Antilles, and even a little bit of Denmark in there, the Dutch. By the 1820s, you start, let me kind of show you everything. Notice this list is 1, 2, 3, 4, has 5 names on it. And as we kind of go through these, note that the list is getting longer and longer, especially as countries begin to become independent. So by 1821, you had the independent country of Mexico and Colombia and Dominican Republic. And Spain still has some, Spain still controls some things like Cuba and Puerto Rico. And that is until the Spanish-American War. So around the end of the 1800s, around 1898, you had the Spanish-American War, and where the U.S. fought Spain. And part of what happened at the end is the U.S. actually gained territory that had formerly belonged to the Spanish, including initially Cuba and then Mexico. So Puerto Rico still remains a U.S. territory. And then later, indirectly, we even got part of the Panama Canal Zone. That wasn't directly through the Spanish-American War, but it was around that period of time as well. So Cuba eventually became independent, but the U.S. still has some naval bases and things there. We control an area called the Canal Zone, which I'll show in a moment. Additionally, the United States had many of its corporations coming in and establishing plantations. So the point being is that the U.S. has had a kind of a either direct or indirect, pretty heavily involvement in this part of the world. In fact, a lot of these former colonies never did become independent. In fact, they're still what's called non-self-governing territories. So if you look at this figure, it says some FR, BR. This means that they're, actually that's not the best figure, but let me just show it this way. So many of the islands, you have things like the British Virgin Islands or the US Virgin Islands are still territories that are held by other countries. And part of the reason, this is going to be true in the Pacific Ocean as well, part of the reason is that it is difficult for very small islands to sustain themselves economically. So oftentimes they're more dependent on other countries for aid and support. All right, so 1898, now the US has control of Cuba and it has control of Puerto Rico. This is Colombia here. A little after that, in early 1903, Panama becomes independent. The U.S. has some hand in that and gets a concession of the Panama Canal Zone here, which the U.S. controls into the later 1900s. Cuba becomes independent, but Puerto Rico remains a U.S. territory. But by the 1980s, you can see this list has grown quite long. You have the Central American countries, various ones in the Caribbean. And a little bit about agriculture in the Americas, because some of the agriculture is related to the colonial period, that you have different approaches by different colonial powers. That in Spanish-controlled areas, you had what's called the hacienda system. These are these massive big ranches and land holdings that were not used as intensely as plantations were. They were a mix of commercial activity and subsistence agriculture. So you might have some type of economic, commercial activity happening, like growing cattle for sale, but then the people who live there might also have their own gardens where they grow food. In fact, this is a more uniquely Mexico-specific thing, but when they had a revolution, they had land reforms, they actually had a system that was similar, but instead of there being one rich landowner, the land was communally owned. But you had something that was something like the hacienda system, but everybody kind of was part owner of this system. Now, in contrast, especially, for example, the French. So Haiti is going to be a good example where we have plantation. That Haiti, was really deforested and planted with sugar cane. This is part of the the slavery period where people in slavery were brought in to work on these plantations. You may have heard of plantations in the U.S. like cotton plantations, and this was even more so into Central America, and into the Caribbean and out down through South America. So plantations are a type of commercial agriculture. These are for efficiency and profit. They grow export crops like sugar, bananas, and coffee. So one thing that you find is that you have different types of agricultural patterns in the French colony of Haiti versus the Spanish colony of the Dominican Republic. And we'll watch a video that kind of highlights this, but just kind of show you this has actually resulted in maybe in differences in their physical environment, that you have much more deforestation on the Haiti side than you do in the Dominican Republic side.